I'll share the. All right, I'll share the links on other places. So.
We're in line.
I'm going to make you mod. I'll ping a few people and we can get started. Can you hear me okay, Fateh?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Should we get started? Okay. So we are on page 45 of the book, Science of the Cosmos, Science of the Soul. We'll read till about page 57 today, and then I'll stop and then we can discuss, inshallah. Okay. And we're also streaming on YouTube live, and we'll have this recorded later on if anybody misses this session. Okay. Taqleed and Tahqiq. In his attempts to reconstruct Islamic thought, Allama Iqbal was much concerned with overcoming taqleed or imitation and reviving ijtihad, the independent judgment that allows a person to make sound legal decisions on the basis of the Quran and the Hadith. But as he well knew, the word taqleed has two opposites in the Islamic sciences. If we're discussing jurisprudence and the Sharia, its opposite is ijtihad. And Islamic law holds that Muslim believers have the duty either to follow someone else's ijtihad or to be mujtahids themselves. In the intellectual sciences, taqleed's opposite is tahqiq, verification or realization. Tahqiq derives from the same root as haqq, which means truth, reality, appropriateness, rightness, responsibility, and duty. Tahqiq means not only to understand the truth and righteousness and the appropriateness of things, but also to respond to them correctly by putting into practice the demands that they make upon the soul. By its nature, understanding of any kind is intensely personal. One can understand the haqq of things only for oneself and in oneself. A muhaqqiq is someone who knows without the intermediary of transmission and acts appropriately. He fulfills his responsibility toward God, creation, and society on the basis of a verified and realized knowledge, not on the basis of imitating the opinions and activities of others. When great Muslims of the past, such as Rumi or Al-Ghazali, criticized taqleed, they were not criticizing imitation of the ulama in the matters of the Sharia. This is a very, very important point from what we were discussing yesterday. Rather, they were attacking taqleed in questions of understanding. You cannot understand God or your own self by quoting the opinions of others, not even if the others are the Quran and the Prophet. The only way to understand things is to find out for yourself, even though you need the help of those who already know. The goal was to allow people to think properly, not to follow someone else's thinking. On the basis of proper thought, people can reach a correct understanding of the object that pertains strictly to intelligence. The first and most important of these objects is Tawheed, the one truth that underlies every other truth. The real disaster that looms over Islamic tradition has little to do with ijtihad and everything to do with tahqiq. A society without living mujtahids can continue to function more or less adequately on the basis of imitating the scholars of the past. A society without living muhaqqiqs, however, has surrendered the ground of intelligence. It cannot hope to remain true to its principles because it cannot understand its principles. What I am saying is that Tawheed can only be understood through realization, not imitation, and certainly not through ijtihad. Once Muslims lose sight of their own tradition of understanding, they have lost the ability to see with the eye of Tawheed. To lose the ability To see with the eye of Tawheed means to fall into seeing with the eye of Shirk, or associating other gods with God. If the Quran considers unrepentant shirk the most unforgivable sin, this is no doubt because it entails an utter distortion of human understanding, a corruption of the human fitrah, and an obscuration of the intelligence that is innate to every human being. Given that Tawheed is the primary duty of every Muslim, and given that Tawheed can be defined negatively as the avoidance of shirk, it follows that avoiding shirk is the primary duty of every Muslim. And just as Tawheed is the first principle of right thinking, so also shirk is the first principle of wrong thinking. In other words, shirk is an intellectual issue, just as Tawheed is an intellectual issue. Any form of thinking that is not rooted in Tawheed necessarily participates in shirk. Pre-modern science. By mentioning the rehabilitation of Islamic thought, I mean to suggest that the Islamic intellectual tradition is suffering from a grave illness. Although a good deal of thinking goes on among contemporary Muslims, little of it has roots in the Islamic intellectual tradition. It frequently calls upon the Quran and the Hadith as witness, but it is based on the habits of mind that were developed in the West during the modern period. These habits of mind, if judged by the principles of Islamic thinking, are misguided and wrong-headed. In other words, they are rooted in shirk, not Tawheed. If we accept that traditional Islamic thought is gravely ill, it will be obvious that recovery demands intensive care. Among other things, it will involve a thorough reevaluation of the nature of intellectual health. It will necessitate careful scrutiny of the great texts of Islamic philosophy and theoretical Sufism, and a serious attempt to understand Islamic principles by way of realization and not imitation. Before rehabilitation can begin, the illness must be correctly diagnosed. The diagnosis of an intellectual illness depends upon recognizing errors for what it is. The problem here is that the illness is omnipresent, not only in the Islamic world, but also elsewhere. It is so much a part of the way that most people think that they imagine it to be natural and normal, like someone suffering from a debilitating disease since childhood. People have lost any sense of what health might involve. This disease is coextensive with the worldview that informs modern thought. It is very difficult to characterize the modern worldview with a single label. One word that has been often suggested is quote unquote scientism. The belief that the scientific method and scientific findings are the sole criterion for truth. Like most belief systems, scientism has become second nature to its believers. It is a basic characteristic of the modern worldview and the contemporary zeitgeist. People see the world and their own psyches in terms of what they have learned in schools, universities, and television documentaries. It is simply assumed that the universe described by science is the real universe. If religious teachings are taken seriously, they are understood as pertaining merely to ritual and morality, not to the real world, since only science provides reliable knowledge of the truth of the universe. One of the many implications of the scientific worldview is the common belief that the cosmology and natural sciences developed in the Islamic intellectual tradition were early stages of what we nowadays call science, and most of these early findings have now been proven false. But a basic fallacy informs this view of pre-modern science: the assumption that its aims and goals were the same as those of contemporary science. If this were true, then indeed the pre-modern ideas would be incorrect. However, the fact is that the Muslim scientists, all of whom were trained in the intellectual tradition, were busy with a task that is far different from that which occupies modern scientists. In order to understand the Islamic intellectual tradition, it might be better to avoid altogether the use of the word science to designate what they were doing, given that this word has been preempted by the empirical methodologies that characterize the modern period. Instead, we need to recover a term that represents the real goal of Muslim intellectuals. One possible name for both the methodology and the goal of the tradition, a name that was in fact commonly employed, hikmah, or wisdom. This word has the advantage of not implying a scientific and empirical approach to things, and it also has the advantage of being a divine attribute. In English, it makes perfect sense to say that God is wise, but not that he is scientist. The English word wisdom and the Arabic word hikmah have preserved enough of their ancient meaning to imply both right thought and right activity, both intellectual perfection and moral perfection. In contrast, modern scientists long ago abandoned any claim that science can help people find the road to right activity, not to speak of moral perfection. The role of science is simply to provide more power over God's creation. Science does not and cannot address the issue of understanding the true nature of the universe, because the true nature of the universe cannot be understood without reference to the transcendent, intelligent, unseen principles that govern the universe. Nor can science address the issue of how we are to find the wisdom to employ correctly the power that we gain over creation. That is the job, scientists will tell us, of theologians, moralists, and politicians. Another name that fairly describes the goal of Islamic thought is tahqiq. The focus of Muslim intellectuals was not on the practical affairs of this world, but on the full realization of human intelligence. This demanded not only discovering the haqq of things, their truth and reality, but also acting in accordance with that haqq. This could only be determined by reference to al-haqq, the real, the absolute reality that is God. Tahqiq demands both right thought and right activity, both intellectual perfection and moral perfection. The Islamic quest for wisdom was always a quest to achieve unity with the divine light or the divine spirit. By the nature of the quest, Muslim intellectuals knew from the outset that everything had come from the One and will return to the One. Their quest was not to, quote unquote, believe that God is one, because they already knew that God is one. The unity of ultimate reality was too self-evident to be doubted. The quest was to understand the implications of unity thoroughly and completely. In brief, the purpose of searching for wisdom was what we can call the tahqiq of Tawheed. And it had two complementary dimensions. It meant first to verify and realize the truth of Tawheed for oneself, and second, to put that truth into practice in all thought and activity. The goal, in other words, was spiritual transformation. This was understood to involve a total conformity with the divine attributes, sifat, and character traits, akhlaq. It was often called ta'alluh, de-informity, or takhalluq bil ikhlaq Allah, assuming as one's own character, as one own the character traits of God. Tawheed was considered both the seed and fruit of human possibility. It was the seed that was planted in human awareness, and it was the fruit of the soul's tree, perfect understanding and perfect activity. In such a view of things, it was impossible to separate the realms of learning into independent domains. The tahqiq of Tawheed was a holistic enterprise that yielded a unified vision. This vision demanded the unity of the human subject with the cosmic object. That is, the conformity of the full human soul with the cosmos in all its grandeur. Soul and cosmos were seen as complementary manifestations of the one single principle. When God created Adam in his own image, he also created the universe in his own image. Perfect understanding means the ability to see all things in their proper places, as divine images and in their relationship with the source. The basic position of the tradition was always that understanding the knowing self, the subject that takes the cosmos as its objects, was essential to the quest. It was impossible to ignore the self or to pretend that it was anything other than an integral part of a greater whole. It is here in particular that the Western tradition diverged from the Islamic. Any careful investigation of the great thinkers of the Enlightenment, the fathers of modern thought, shows that they completely ignored the complementarity of soul and cosmos. Brian Appleyard does a brilliant job of analyzing the phenomenon in his Understanding the Present. For example, he writes, Protestantism and the Renaissance had effectively prepared the way, the first by insisting on the moral centrality of the individual, and the second by its celebration of heroic humanism. The price was the expulsion of the self from the world. For science made exiles of us all. It took our souls out of our bodies. The tendency is evident in the primary philosophers of the Enlightenment. Descartes provided a philosophical correlative of Protestant internalization. Kant removed the real world beyond the possibility of ordinary human knowledge. Both that was the object of scientific investigation, both placed the world that was the object of scientific investigation beyond the realm of the self. The key paradox of the modern was established. Science was everything we could logically know of the world, but it could not include ourselves. The more we knew, the less we appeared to have a role. The world worked without us. The reign of Taqdir. I said earlier that modernity is governed by a certain type of false thinking, and I suggested that one name for that thinking is scientism, which is false because it makes unwarranted claims. But there is a much deeper reason why scientism is essentially false, and that is because science, by its very presuppositions, negates Tawheed and affirms Taqdir. By no means do I mean to say that Taqdir is inherently false. Rather, it is short-sighted and incomplete. It misses the important points because it denies implicitly, if not explicitly, the ultimacy of the one reality that stands beyond all other realities. Once we understand things in terms of Tawheed, we can understand the origin and destiny of the cosmos and the soul. And we can also grasp the present status of the world in which we live in. Tawheed answers the ultimate questions and allows people to orient themselves in terms of real beginnings and real ends. If Taqdir is to have any legitimacy, it must be oriented and governed by Tawheed. Taqdir without Tawheed can at best analyze, differentiate, divide, and classify, but it cannot provide a unifying vision. Any perspective based on Taqdir denies implicitly that existence has a purpose. It rejects the idea that human aspirations to achieve moral and ethical betterment and to become intellectually and spiritually perfect have any grounding in objective reality. Consequently, this perspective means that the more Taqdir is intensified, the less we as human beings will appear to have any role at all to play in the cosmos. The Muslim cosmologists paid a good deal of attention to Taqdir, but for them it was a divine attribute. It was God's activity of bringing the universe into existence. When they investigated the origin of all things, they were attempting to understand the nature of Taqdir. In effect, they saw God as Al-Mukhattir, he who produces the many. In contrast, when they discussed psychology and the return of the soul to God, the primary issue was how the soul could be Muwahhid, someone who affirms the one who establishes unity. How can we, beings who dwell in multiplicity, unify our vision and activity and return happily and freely to God? In the intellectual tradition, we can understand Taqdir as the divine principle that makes multiplicity appear from the one. Tawheed can then be understood as the complement of Taqdir. It designates the divine and human principle that reintegrates the many into the one. The philosopher Afdal Din al-Qashani, for example, tells us that the universal intellect is God's vicegerent in the origin, which is to say that the cosmos in all its multiplicity appears from unity on the basis of the radiance of divine omniscience. In contrast, human beings are God's vicegerent in the return, which is to say that the human role in the cosmos is to take multiplicity back to unity. In brief, the intellectual tradition recognizes both Taqdir and Tawheed, but Taqdir is kept subordinate to Tawheed, which is to say that the many is seen as forever governed by the one. The world and all things within it stay in the hands of the real. And can never leave. The proper role of Taqdir can only be understood in terms of Tawheed. Once we see that God created human beings to act as his vicegerents and unify the whole of creation through their spiritual and moral perfection, then we can understand why God brought multiplicity into existence in the first place. Real understanding and real knowledge depend on grasping the ultimate end of human existence, which corresponds with the ultimate end of creation itself. Moreover, human completion and perfection depend on acting in conformity with real knowledge. The Islamic worldview might be characterized as Taqdir in the service of Tawheed. In contrast, the scientific worldview can be characterized as Taqdir without Tawheed. This can be seen clearly in the fruit of modern learning. Take, for example, the ever more specialized nature of the scientific, social, and humanistic disciplines. the disintegration of any coherent vision of human nature in the modern university, the unintelligibility of the individual sciences to any but the experts, and the total incomprehensibility of the edifice of science and learning as a whole. When taqdeer rules over human thought, the result can only be analysis. Differentiation, distinction, disunity, disharmony, disequilibrium, and dissolution. Given that modern science and learning are rooted in the world's multiplicity, not in God's unity, their fruit is division and dispersion without end, not unification and harmony. One of Iqbal's great insights, which he did not follow up as he might have, was his understanding that modern science yields disunity and dissonance by definition. He wrote, "We must not forget that what is called science is a mass of sectional views of reality. The various natural sciences are like so many vultures falling on the dead body of nature and each running away with a piece of its flesh. Nature as the subject of science is a highly artificial affair, and this artificiality is the result of that selective process to which science must subject her in the interests of precision. Modern science wants precision, quote unquote, in order to separate things out from their overall context. Only after a highly artificial view of reality has been manufactured can we ignore the objectivity of moral and ethical principles and justify the view that human beings have the right to control God's creation as they see fit, without the guidance of wisdom. Perhaps the power of taqdeer becomes most obvious in the realm of ethics and morality. For the Islamic intellectual perspective, adherence to right activity and actualization of praiseworthy characteristics, akhlaq al-hamida, are demanded by the objective nature of things. After all, the world is actually and truly a display of the divine attributes, and the human soul is actually and in fact made in God's image. Any human soul that does not actualize the divine character traits such as wisdom, justice, mercy, compassion, love, and forgiveness has failed in the task of achieving human status. A methodology that yields an unbridgeable gulf between truth and ethics is ignorance, not knowledge. Such an approach ignores the haqq of things, both their true nature and the moral demands that they make upon us. Under the reign of taqdeer, intelligence and virtue are torn from their roots in the real world. The net result can only be the dispersal of human excellence in a vast range of unrelated endeavors, with no connections to be made between knowing and being, science and ethics. The raw power that is accumulated through acquiring instrumental and manipulative knowledge results in the loss of human goodness. The goal of thought. I said that there is a fundamental difference between the Islamic intellectual tradition and modern learning. One way to understand this is to see that Muslim intellectuals were striving to achieve a unitary and unified vision of all things by actualizing the transpersonal intellect, the divine spirit latent in the human soul. In contrast, modern scientists want to achieve an ever more exact and precise understanding of things, one that allows for increased control over the environment, the human body, and society. To the extent that this control is achieved, however, it is given over to the ignorant and forgetful selfhood, what was called caprice, hawa, or appetite, shahwa, in the texts. It is not put into the hands of the fully actualized intelligence of God's vicegerent on earth. This is especially obvious in the various forms of government that have appeared in the modern world, all of which have taken advantage of scientific, technological, and bureaucratic power to instill docility into their subjects. Another characteristic of the intellectual tradition that places it in stark contrast with modern learning is the intensely personal nature of the quest. Tahqiq aims at the discovery of the haqq within the seeker's own intelligence. That intelligence was understood and indeed experienced as a supra-individual, transpersonal, universal breadth of awareness. Every seeker of wisdom had to learn metaphysics and cosmology for himself or herself. Each had to follow the path of self-discovery as a personal calling. In other words, aspiring philosophers had to relearn the nature of the cosmos for themselves, not depend on what was written in the authoritative texts. From a modern perspective, it looks like they were trying to reinvent the wheel, quote unquote. Implicit in the metaphor is the technological application of knowledge that is a primary motivation for scientific research. and was in no way part of the quest for wisdom. Actualizing wisdom can only be achieved in realization, which is awakened intelligence and ethical activity. It is a common misinterpretation of Islamic intellectual history to say that Muslim scholars made scientific discoveries, but then failed to follow up on them, so the torch of learning passed to the West. This is to read the empirical methodology and practical goals of modern science back into the intellectual methods and spiritual goals of the wisdom tradition. The goal was not to establish a fund of transmitted learning or knowledge, which other scientists could imitate and build upon, and from which technologists could draw for practical ends. The goal was to discover the truth for oneself. Rumi sums up the difference between a muhakkik and a muqallid, between someone who thinks for himself and someone who imitates others in the following verses. A child on the path does not have the same thought of men. His imagination cannot be compared with the true tahqiq. The thought of children is of nurses and milk, raisins and walnuts, crying and weeping. The muqallid is like a sick child. Even if he offers subtle arguments and proofs, his profundity in proofs and objections drives him away from true insight. He takes the collyrium of his secret heart and uses it to offer rejoinders. Rumi then speaks for the whole Islamic tradition, intellectual tradition, when he says that no one can achieve true and real understanding until he stops imitating others and finds that for himself. The implication for the modern situation is clear. There can be no rehabilitation of Islamic thought unless Muslim thinkers put the tahqiq of Tawheed back at the center of their concerns. That's the end of the reading for today. We'll stop the recording and inshallah.